Without further ado, I'll get out of the way and introduce you to Mark Tyndall, who is our esteemed podcaster and facilitator today. And I've been on the other side of Mark's podcast, which is called Lawyer by Day, and I can also very highly recommend. Mark has a particular knack at getting people to open up, and it's a joy to listen to, and I think gives you an insight into the law and lawyers in our part of the world in a way that is really compelling. So you're in excellent hands. He knows his way around the tech expertly, and I think at the end of today you should come away with some really useful insights in what makes for a good podcast, how to go about doing it both in terms of the storyline and the tech, and how you can apply it in your workplaces. So thanks again for coming. And over to you.
Thanks, Lynn. It's great that Lynn mentions that discussion we had on my podcast, Lawyer by Day. We had a great conversation about the power of podcasting, but probably more specifically about interviewing and what it means to connect with people in a very isolated age sometimes. So we had a great conversation, which is worth, of course they say it's worth listening to, so you can have look it up if you get a moment. So it's a very exciting time to be involved in podcasting. I've spoken to a few people that just before we started who might be in a situation where their organisation is saying, we'd love to look into or do a podcast, can you please go find out what that would actually mean in practice? What are the steps we need to take and how do we scope it, and probably by extension, can you please do it and be responsible for it? So the one kind of thing I'd like you to take away from today is a map from this day through to the launch of your first episode of a podcast. Now that is, I have to say from the outset, just a silly task to try and embark on, because it is a massive process with a lot of detail involved in it. So what we're going to achieve today is a map. It's going to give you a pathway to getting to this endpoint of a first episode. And there will be many points along the way where you'll be frustrated and having to learn a lot more, of course, which is, I find, very exciting, and it's one of the great opportunities of using this thing, which is an opportunity to learn about a new way of communicating. I've got a whole bunch of equipment up here. We've got really limited time today, but if you are going to be the person, or likely to be the person, to be holding a microphone, to be the one actually doing some recording and figuring out how to do that well, come up when you get a chance and have a play around with some of this stuff. We'll talk about the specifics of recording and equipment and what all this stuff is, maybe after the morning tea break. But if you're going to be the one holding the microphone, I want you to come up and actually pick some of this stuff up and have a look. If you've got your own earbuds, your own headphones, plug them into the headphone port on one of these ones and just walk around with it, hit record, see what it sounds like, ask your colleagues some questions and see what it sounds like, make some mistakes. But make today the first time you do a bit of recording, rather than when you've got an interviewee sitting there and you don't know what you're doing, because I've done that before and it's scary. Okay, this is a map. We're going to talk about what a podcast is, because it's not an academic question, because what a podcast is in the technical sense impacts on the decisions that you make, the costs you incur in making a podcast, and how it runs. So we're going to talk about what a podcast is pretty quickly, why you might do it. And I think this is probably actually the one core thing I'd like you to take away today, which is to understand why you would do this, what the general benefits of having a podcast are, but also being very clear about your purpose and about your audience. Now, I know a number of you are communications people in the room, and this is bread and butter stuff, things you do every day. But what I want you to be really clear on with podcasting is your purpose, exactly why you're doing this, and making all this effort, and maybe spending some money, and who your audience is. So we're going to do a quick exercise to do with that too. We're going to talk about planning. This is actually just a big laundry list of things to think about that you might not have encountered before that are specific to podcasting. So just aspects of podcasting, why they fail, why they go really well, and some of the nuts and bolts type things. So that goes into planning. Recording, we're going to talk about equipment, some basic recording techniques, some tips and tricks, but also some common traps. And hopefully, maybe during the break and afterwards, if you've got time, we'll have a go at some more recording activity. Editing, we're going to fly through editing, which is really, I'm just going to point you to a bit of software essentially and show you roughly what it looks like, the basics of what you might actually be doing in an editing platform. But that's something that unfortunately you're going to have to go and spend the hours kind of figuring out, and as you go. And then sharing, pretty importantly, and which has some cost associated with it, often, is how you actually share your creation with the world. You've got this audio file, and you've got to do something with it to make it available, and then promote it. All right, so that's the map. Today we're coming away with a map from today to getting your first episode out, and these are the kind of big steps along the way. All right, we're going to start with what this stuff actually is. Can anyone actually tell me what a podcast is? Even just an impression of what the experience of what a podcast is. A video broadcast definitely can be. Yes.
Audio.
Yes.
Audio conversation.
Audio conversation, totally.
Yep.
So many podcasts are a conversation between two people, and it comes through an audio channel. And you see people on the tram lost in their own little world because they're a part of an audio conversation.
It's like a custom-made radio show.
Yes,
in a way.
totally. There's so many parallels and connections to radio. So people do call it radio, internet radio. Yes.
And it's an oral way to communicate information.
Yes, totally. When you say that, what do you think is the advantage or the power of having an oral way of communicating information?
Well, you can absorb the information while doing something else.
Yes, which we'll see. There's ABC Insights did a survey recently about podcast listening behaviours, and people love podcasts and listen to them on weekends and Saturday afternoons because they're doing other things and they listen to them. Anything else?
It's story. People resonate with personal story.
Totally. It's such an amazing medium for storytelling that TV can't provide. Radio can, but who of us here have access to radio? Like, who produces the show? We don't have control over that. It's an amazing forum for storytelling, and that's the thing that took me on podcasts when I started listening to
I guess it's on demand as well.
Yes.
So it's when it suits you to listen to it, as well as being able to do it when you're doing something else.
it. It tends to be relevant in today's age, doesn't it? Which is I love radio, but I never sit down and actually listen to radio, not even in the car. It's on demand. You pick it up when you want it. The technology is a bit old with podcasting, but the beauty of it is that you can have it wherever you want it.
The only thing I would say about podcasting to other mediums for storytelling is it is confined to technology. You need access to it,
Yeah,
and not all of the audiences that you might want to reach would have that platform.
that's really important.
Like the infrastructure for IT and the actual arts.
And this is probably very relevant for if you're from a community legal centre and thinking about what your purpose is and who your audience is. Exactly who's going to have the mobile phone, the device, or the computer, and the accessibility of that data stream. You can be, servicing or trying to sell advertising into people who have a lot of money, like different markets. But if you're trying to access a demographic or I won't call it a market, if you're trying to access a group of people to communicate something to them differently, will they actually have a smartphone? And there's data out there about that. I don't have it in these slides, but that's good. Oh, that's a pretty. Oh yeah,
Can I
good.
ask that?
Yeah, of
Not
course.
just about whether or not they have access to a smartphone, but whether or not they are confident enough to actually know how to put a photograph. Like I'm thinking about my mum.
Yeah.
She's very confident in many ways. She's 71, but I have to put her photographs on, and I have to encourage her to listen to it.
And it's really powerful. And this is a privilege and wealth kind of question still. But the advent of smart speakers like Amazon, Alexa, and the Google Home kind of ecosystem is that older generations are listening to far more on-demand content now because of how accessible it is, and you can literally talk to your speaker. Again, that's not accessing a low SES community, but audio is breaking into all these different communities because of the advent of simpler technology in the home. So you can just say to Amazon Alexa, play me the Department of Justice podcast, and it will come up with the amazing stories we were talking about before. All right, they're all fantastic. There was an amazing list of things, and more than I had thought about before today. So thank you. This is a pretty dry definition. It is a digital audio file. It's on the internet. You can download it to a device. And importantly, and probably relevant for all of you, new installments can be received by subscribers automatically. So once your community member has subscribed to your podcast, anything that pops up on that feed, depending on their settings, will go automatically onto their device, which is a pretty powerful thing. They make one decision to subscribe, and then they receive episode after episode to their device. It's great to only have that one contact point and get recurring kind of engagement like that, as long as they listen to it, which they might not, and as long as they don't actively decide to unsubscribe. It's probably better this is probably the bit that we need to spend just a little bit of time on, which is the technical part of it, which is technically what is a podcast. Now, what we start with a podcast, and at the end of this process, that map we've talked about, is you're going to end up with an audio file or several audio files. These ones here. A podcast audio file sits on a computer, on a server, essentially the internet, which is accessible to anyone who wants to load that file. Now you can distribute that content in all sorts of ways. You could actually get a link to this episode 1 MP3 file and just email it to people and say, here's a link, click on it, and you'd be able to stream it essentially in a browser. You could open it or on a phone and listen to that one episode. That's fine. You might be creating a one-off kind of episode, one-off kind of feature item that there's nothing to recur, it's not going to be followed up by anything else, and you could distribute it that way. But with a podcast, you've got these multiple audio files and new ones popping up every week or every month, and you need a way essentially of distributing that to your listeners. The way that works, and it's actually pretty old technology, is technology called RSS. So a podcast, you could say, is actually what's called an RSS feed. Hopefully you can read that, or you can read it on your slides. But for example, this is, if you've heard of Serial, which is a hugely popular true crime podcast, now in its 3rd season, this is the Serial podcast RSS feed. It's a single URL, so web address, a single web address, that essentially gives you a list of all the episodes of Serial that are out there. It's formatted in a really particular way so that devices can read it and say, oh, well, I know this is an episode and there's a new episode and I can load it onto my device. It includes episode details like the description, and most importantly, it provides a link to the actual file. So there's an example of an RSS feed here. This is my podcast RSS feed, or a section of it. And you can see how it's formatted in this really regular way. It's got a title, it's got the date it was released, the description, which explains what it's about, but also just why someone should listen to it, and then the very specific MP3 file, which is the content. So when we say RSS feed, we really mean a nicely formatted list of podcast episodes. So why is this relevant? Because you might say, I thought I upload my podcast episodes to iTunes or to Spotify, that they sit there. I'll talk about that in a second. Essentially, with this RSS feed, your phone here or your device with this address makes a direct connection to this server, to this computer, and it downloads those episodes directly from that server. So iTunes isn't involved in that at all. Spotify, no, none of the directories are involved at all. But that's assuming that you've known how to find a podcast. And what the directories over here really do is tell you all of the podcasts that are out there and what the RSS feed address is. So it's really Spotify and iTunes. When you see all this, I'm listening to Teacher's Pet at the moment. When I found that through iTunes, essentially what that is doing is pointing me to the RSS feed of the podcast, which is sitting somewhere completely different to iTunes. iTunes doesn't have to do much work at all, really. They just act as a big catalogue. And that's what mine looks like in iTunes. So when you click on one of these episodes, it will actually take you through to my website, essentially where my MP3s are hosted. Okay, does that make sense? That's a really quick run for the technology. It's actually quite old technology. It's designed for creating blogs, so that when you write a new blog post, an RSS feed would automatically be updated and someone would see the new article, but it's been adapted for podcasting. It has some of the advantages we talked about before. All right, why you would make one? I feel like just jumping into the popularity of podcasts and how they're exploding is a good place to start. If not, maybe a bit misguided, and I'll talk about why. But I would recommend that everyone in their own time goes to the ABC website and searches for the ABC Audience Data and Insights for Podcasts, which was released a couple of months ago. And it's really interesting reading, and it should probably be a pretty key source document for the work you're doing in pitching work or explaining what's possible. Far more Australians are listening to podcasts than they were a few years ago. Like 62% claim to have tried listening to a podcast ever, and more, so 33% have listened to podcasts in the past month. We're also seeing an increase in people claiming to have listened to a podcast within the past week. So actual regularly engaged listeners. We mentioned this before when we're talking about what a podcast is. I find these numbers really interesting. And I think it's really good news for all of us here as well, because I assume, but I probably shouldn't assume, that there is an educational or an informational aspect to what you might want it to be doing with podcasts, which is people are overwhelmingly listening to podcasts to hear things they're interested in, to learn new things, and to inform them, but also to entertain them. Now, I actually found that a bit surprising because I thought people listened to it primarily for entertainment and had some benefit to learning or education, kind of ancillary to that. But I think that's really important, and you can use these numbers to demonstrate that people are actually seeking out to learn things through this medium. Interestingly, if you're going after a younger demographic, 14 to 34s, they tend, on average, I think, to be seeking out podcast material for entertainment. That doesn't mean that they're not seeking for learning as well, but I think there's just a weighting to entertainment, interest in entertainment at the younger ages. This is also very important for us in that people are actively listening to new material as well. They're not just sticking to existing channels or things that they know. They're not just listening to the Law Report because they listened to it on the radio previously. So you do have an opportunity to break into a market, or let's call it a market, where there is actually significant demand for this content. Now, I've only got a couple more of these slides, but I love this one as well. And it goes against so much of what people have told me in the past, which is what actually motivates listeners to try a new podcast, to try your new podcast. I think most importantly is this recommendation number. You actually need people out there talking about your podcast for it to, like personally talking about it, to actually get them to subscribe, download and listen to it. Important, like everyone would tell you the episode description is important, but I wouldn't have thought that important, but it really is. You need to write really great descriptions and really engaging content in your episode summaries to make sure people are actually listening to this. this is really interesting too, the host. Who is the voice of your podcast? Who are they? Are they known? Do they have some interesting brand or way of speaking or anything that will connect people to your content and what they want to listen to? I would have put that a bit down the list as well, because finding a host can sometimes happen later in the piece when you're building these things. The brand, your organisation's brand is going to matter, but I would have thought it mattered more than that. And the artwork, people told me years ago, the artwork's the only thing, one of the very few things that a podcast can be judged on. It's just a little cover art that pops up in your phone when you're listening to an episode or when you're looking at it in iTunes. But I take from this that you don't have to worry too much about artwork, and you definitely don't spend any money or real time on the artwork for a podcast. People trying new podcasts are impacted largely by word of mouth and far less by social media or direct engagement by text or email. I think that's fascinating. And when I really think about it, it plays out in my workplace and with my friends. It's literally taking each other's phones and subscribing them to things for each other and recommending things. So you need word of mouth working for you, essentially, if you want to get this content into people's ears. Right, that's like 4 or 5 slides from a much, much longer report. So please, I recommend you download that report and have a think about the data in it for your audience. So that's what we're going to talk about now. I'm going to do a little exercise. You might be at the really early stages of the concept of a podcast, or being asked to deliver one, or consider how an organisation might put one together. You need to be super clear about your purpose and your audience. It's often where podcasts, or most podcasts, fail, is that they don't define their purpose and they don't know who they're actually seeking to talk to speak to. So, in your groups, I think we've got about maybe 25, 30 people here, maybe in groups of 4 or so. I'd like you to spend 5 minutes to identify a very clear purpose and a very clear audience for a podcast. Now, of course, this won't necessarily be the one that your organisation is going after, and it will evolve over time as we plan. But I'd like you to actually come up with a 1 minute, or like 30 second to 1 minute description of these 2 measures and how it will fit in with your other channels of communication that exist at the moment. So I'll give you 5 minutes, and then we're going to do 30 seconds to 1 minute kind of little presentation from each group. If anyone's keen to record their colleague as they give the little pitch about purpose and audience, I want you to come up here and grab one of these 2 recorders here. I'll show you how they work. And you can have a go at listening to what it's like to be in someone's face with a microphone. Okay, off we go, 5 minutes. This planning phase, once you've got your purpose and your audience very clearly defined, this is a list of items that you need to just think about in your plan for the podcast. We're going to talk about the concept. A lot of you have already defined your concept, and they're very exciting. I'm definitely going to listen to them when they come out. But you need to ask questions like, who else is doing it? Like, is there a podcast out there called The Talk that talks about these same issues, or features conversations between parents and kids about this? That's a bit I took from it. Is it already out there? Because if you launch a podcast into that exact same space or niche, it might be an American podcast, that might be different enough. But if someone's doing the same thing, you're doomed to fail, essentially, even if it's really well made and well produced. If it is happening and you identify that, you do your searches and look around and talk to people, and there is something similar, be really clear about how you can do it differently. What do you or your organisation have that can really carve out a clear purpose and concept to do it differently, so that I'll know, well, it's not like the other podcasts, it's like this one. I'm going to tune in for that reason. And really, really test yourself on what you can offer that's unique to you and your organisation. Because if it's quite generalised, chances are someone else has or will do it. And odds are too, you actually won't do as good a job of it if it's not something that you can uniquely offer. From what you've talked about, though, already, some of the concepts you've come up with, they sound quite unique to the organisation, so which is really exciting. The style of it. Now, this is pretty fundamental and goes to resourcing and planning and who in your organisation just might be involved. You will have heard podcasts, which are just one-on-one interviews, and that's like my way by day. I literally sit down with a person and talk to them about X, Y, and Z, and there might be a bit of an introduction at the beginning and an outro at the end, but it's interview-based. Some people don't necessarily engage in storytelling, but they do a type of monologue or short monologue where they're essentially talking to the audience directly about something. And they might be shorter because it's harder to sustain that type of monologue format, but that exists. You could have multiple hosts based on like having a conversation about something, or a panel. Narrative, which I guess could be also described as storytelling, which is an episode with an arc, a start, a beginning, and an end that takes you on some type of journey, or a whole mix of those. The example that I like is called Reply All. It's a podcast about the internet, and it's produced by Gimlet Media in the US. But the thing I really like with having two hosts, and I think should be used more, is a format where one of the hosts goes off and investigates an issue or learns about an issue. It can be over several weeks, and comes back and essentially tells the story, not only of what they've learned or the outcome of their investigation, but their experience of going and finding out about it. It's really powerful because it's a genuine and very authentic conversation which has strong reactions and turning points and has an arc overall. So it goes through a start, a middle and an end with some resolution, which is really powerful. And it's relatively easy to implement because one of you does the work, the other one turns up to the studio and listens and reacts to it. So the two great voices on the tape. Have a really clear think about who in your organisation, whether it's you, other people, can be involved. I'm going to talk about hosts in a minute. But think about format. Listen to lots of podcasts and make a decision about what will speak to your audience that you've just defined. You need a host. Well, you don't necessarily need a host, but most podcasts have a host. Think about voice and whether they have a good voice for it. Sometimes a voice that's really particular is a great brand for a podcast, and people even, like Ira Glass, who essentially started and made This American Life, which is a prolific American podcast. In the years afterwards, people would mimic his voice in a really kind of strange way sometimes because of how distinct and unique it was. People associated it with podcasting and success in podcasting. You don't have to have like a radio voice. You've got to have just someone who can, has a voice that will carry in audio. If you're asking someone else to do it, be really clear on the commitment. It's actually quite a lot of work to get them in a studio or get them set up and record this stuff over time. And they need to be enthusiastic. Ideally, too, they'd be very curious about the subject matter and driven to learn and figure this out on tape. Like to be a part of this, journey you're going to take your audience on. Because if they're not interested, your audience certainly won't be. They might need particular knowledge. So if they are in your organisation, they may be likely to have that knowledge anyway. But what do you need them to be reacting with when they hear something or asking questions or interviewing a person? Because a list of questions for them to ask an interviewee won't cut it. You need them. You don't have to be like Richard Feidler, but you've got to have someone who really reacts and understands the subject matter, so that they can take the conversation where the listener probably would take the conversation. And then there's some skills aspect to it too. We've got some recorders here and some studio gear here that we'll talk about after the break. What skills do they need, and are they going to be able to, learn how to work this stuff? You might get a lot of volunteers in the organisation to be a host, so find ways of assessing that suitability democratically, diplomatically. Content. These are just really specific tips about planning content release. Getting ahead with your content, which is easier said than done, is really powerful. If you can get episodes in the can ready to go and are then releasing them in a defined schedule, then you'll be far less stressed at the time.
Can I share that the Destroy Digital, who's the one who are giving us, we're using their studio, they said you can do a couple of episodes in a day. So like knock a few off.
Yep.
If you've got guests coming in.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
basically what you just said.
If you've got guests coming in and you've got studio time booked, then book out the whole day for the studio if you can. Get lots of people in. Record, like, even if you've got to have a clear, purpose for why you're going to get someone on tape. But if you've got some narration to do, or record everything you can on that day and get all the content ahead of time as much as you can. Yeah, it's a really good tip. Setting an appointment. If you want to grow your audience, and I don't do this. I'll just be honest. I fail at this. Is consistency. Setting an appointment with your audience to say there'll be another episode out in 2 weeks. There'll be another episode out next month, and sticking to that, because I underestimated totally how much of a broken promise on that front, even though you think it's kind of just a thing I'm doing, actually really lets people down. And they might choose to continue to stay subscribed, but when they don't know what to expect, it's actually, it kills engagement. So really think about what's going to be possible, the amount of work that's required. And if you've got to have a monthly or 2 monthly release schedule, or you don't make any promise at all about when the next one out, that's fine. But just be really clear about your schedule and the reality of what it's going to take, because people do get disappointed and tune out.
Can I add something to that?
Of course.
I think whenever I thought about podcasts in the past, I was thinking about it as an ongoing series. But actually, there's a lot of really good examples of contained number of episodes.
Yep.
So that, and maybe sometimes, like I'm thinking about your, or even the Oxfam one, if you've got 15 or 20 topics that you want to deal with, maybe it's better to have the whole thing and then just release it.
Yep.
And then you know that is a resource that people have, as opposed to every once a month or two, maybe we'll think something else and then release that new one. It's kind of liberating to look at it in that way as well, because you don't have to then think about the ongoing pressure of producing content.
Definitely. And it really is up to when you want to release it, but releasing it all at once is a great idea, and it's what a lot of even commercial podcasts do now. The idea being, moving away from this idea that engagement has to come from, having people waiting on a new episode. It's just binge listening. And people come to it at their own time. They might go back to it as well. They might listen to it. Even if you were going after advertising revenue, which, depending on the organisation, it probably won't be, there's new technology, including for dynamic ad insertion. You can put in, you can drop like 12 episodes, and there's technology that could change advertising within those episodes over time as well. So you don't need to be fixed in time about what you might be promoting as well. So it's getting a lot better. It depends on what platform you use, but you can have advertising sold into your podcast that changes whenever people start or stop paying for it. Really good point. Okay. And I think this is something you'll all have worked with in any form of communication, is evergreen versus time-specific content. When you release this stuff, how aged will it sound in a year's time or in 2 years' time? Is that the nature of the content you're creating, which is about a news show about current events? Or is it just because you happen to have mentioned Law Week 2017, like I did in one of my episodes? So when you listen to it, you're like, oh, that's fine, that this is a really old episode, but you already date it. There's an age to that content that people might not like as much. So be really clear about, will your content stand the test of time? Do you need to design it differently to stand the test of time? I'm going to talk really briefly about audio branding and music. It's surprising how attached people get to intro theme songs, and when you change them, people can actually get quite disappointed. and wonder what's going on and ask you questions and things like that. So if you're going to use music as a general approach, you should probably use royalty-free music rather than going down the path of negotiating permission to use your favourite band's songs, or even you can go through, get licensing through app around costs and things like that, as if you're kind of like a small radio station. It's actually much better just to start out, pay for some music, or find free music from one of these websites that brands your episodes. People do get attached to it and like it, and they'll come to expect it. So have a think about what will be right for the tone of the podcast, but also that meets your purpose, aligns with your purpose and the audience listening to it. It's in the header, so that's kind of all I'll say. You'll spend hours looking through these websites and like clips, going, no, this is all wrong. Okay, we might have a morning tea now. I've already run over time.
And Mark, just before you break,
yes.
and I know this will be of particular interest to you and possibly to others in the room. Teacher's pet has just been arrested.
Oh,
Really? Wow.
I was telling Lynn before, I've just started listening to it. I'm like 4 episodes in.
Sorry, ruined the ending.
Well, I already know a bit about it. That's amazing. What, this morning? Oh, wow. What a great day to be in a podcast version. Okay, so we've talked about what a podcast is, the technology, how the files get from the internet to your device and listen to it. We've talked about why you might be doing this. You've now got a clearly defined purpose and audience. And whenever you have any questions or uncertainties along the way, you just go back to what is my purpose and who is my audience. And you've gone through some of these planning issues. You've got a host, you've got your content kind of mapped out, your release schedule. You know when it's all going to happen and who's involved, and avoid some of the pitfalls. And then you actually need to go and record the content. You need to get some of this material on tape. So that's what we're going to talk about. We had a chat about this in the break. Have you thought about where your content must be recorded? Where does the event or people or whatever it is you record, ambience, exist? And what activity is going on when you're doing it? Thinking about this will determine completely what equipment you'll need, the approach to take to it, and ultimately too how much it might cost you. The key takeaway, and always it's bad to frame things in a negative, but I think we've probably all experienced it. If you subscribe to a podcast or listen to a podcast to see what it's like, and the audio is bad, if voices are loud, and one voice is loud and one's quiet, and you're constantly adjusting the volume to try and hear something, and someone then shouts in your ears, it doesn't matter how great or engaging the people are or the material is, people will simply stop listening. And they're often quite, can be quite offended too when they have a bad kind of oral experience. Like when people do take it pretty hard. So thinking about audio quality and getting that right from the outset, particularly that first episode that people often, the first thing they engage with, to get that right from the beginning, or at least have the best shot at it as possible. And also, getting it wrong defeats the purpose of doing something in audio anyway, which is like the wonderful aspect, the beauty of people's voice and being able to hear that conversation. That's totally lost with bad audio. So, there are two main kind of categories of approach that I'm just going to summarize into two categories and suggest some really clear ways forward for you to make your podcast, to record your podcast. The first is essentially to work in a studio all of the time, and the other one is to have options to record out in the field, so outside of a studio environment. This is completely dependent on what you've decided your podcast is, where you can record, who it is, and how much you can afford to spend. So remember that the two different kind of domains are in the studio and then in the field, out and about. Sitting in a studio with a microphone like this, which I'll talk about in a second, is suited to doing in-person interviews, narration, if you happen to be recording any music, which you probably won't. the benefit of being in a studio for these more controlled kind of discussions is that the high quality microphones and the headphones and cables and even editing software, the computer to edit it on, are all provided for you. The room is soundproofed in a very particular way so that it creates a natural kind of tone to the room and doesn't echo your voice around and make it sound strange and unpleasant. And studios that you'll find here in Melbourne have a per hour higher cost, and you don't need to invest in any equipment or very little equipment in any case. So this is a great way of starting out a podcast with pretty low cost. And the ones that I'm going to recommend, because I use them quite a lot, are the City of Melbourne studios. There's one at Library at the Dock in Docklands, and there's one at Kathleen Syme in Carlton. You'd have to check the prices again on the website, but for an organisation, and if it's not for profit, it ranges between $10 and $30 an hour, I think. And the fantastic benefit of this, of course, is that all of this stuff is provided for you. You've got some learning to do. You're going to have to book some time to go in there, even several hours and maybe even a couple of sessions, to figure out how it all works. You need to do an induction that's run by the library staff, but that is not, the induction is how to use the equipment safely and how to not break the equipment, essentially. It's not a course in audio recording, and it's not a course in advanced audio or recording or editing techniques. So there's still a bunch of learning to do. I'm going to firstly run through some equipment that you might use in a studio, really briefly, and if afterwards you want to come and have a look, please feel free. So you're going to find in this studio, you can't see the photo here, but this is a photo of just the control room. Behind here is the actual studio. So there's glass here, and as a producer of a podcast, you might sit here operating at the computer and this desk. But most likely, you might actually record some stuff in here if you like, because it is soundproofed. But you're likely to set up microphones in this other room, separated by glass, for the interview or whatever's actually going to take place. It's similar at Kathleen Syme. I've done a bunch of recording at Kathleen Syme. I actually interviewed Lynn at Library at the Dock, the previous one. So when you turn up, you're going to find a big drawer of microphones. Turn this off for a second. And the ones that you'll probably use for audio for vocal audio are called Condenser Mics. This is a cardioid condenser mic. There's probably not a huge need to actually go through the technology of the different technology of microphones. But things that look like these boxy kind of condenser microphones are amazingly sensitive, and they're great at picking up voices and vocals and kind of the character of voices. You sit very close to them as well, and you essentially sit close to them and turn the volume right down. That has the benefit of capturing the full range of your voice and all the nuances in your voice, but also excludes other sounds in the environment. Because you're so close and the volume's turned right down, it's not going to pick up a sound from out the back there. So that's a condenser mic. You'll find other microphones in these studios, which aren't as suitable to recording voices in that environment, but they look a bit more friendly, and the temptation is sometimes to use a microphone that seems a bit easier, but I encourage you to use these condenser mics. They have Rode, these are Audio Technica mics, this is the brand, but the studios have Rode mics. It's another brand. This is on a boom arm, which I use to connect to a desk at home, but I also use it when I'm out and about sometimes to want to use these microphones. It just attaches to a table, but you'll find microphone stands, which you've probably dealt with before in these studios. They're pretty simple to use and set up. The thing that gets a bit more complicated or looks a bit more foreign is this thing that's called a shock mount. What it is a kind of tube. It's hard to actually turn around and show you. A tube in which the microphone sits like this, but it's suspended by elastic bands. What it means is that any vibrations in the floor, like that, don't pass up this table through this arm and make a big loud bang sound in the microphone. So when you're using one of these condenser microphones, these blocky looking ones, tall blocky looking microphones, you need to use the shock mount. They're there in the studio, so that needs to be attached to your microphone stand. And then it just slips in there like that. Just make sure it's like loose and going to fall out. But it just means that like if I hit the floor, these rubber bands absorb that booming sound because they're very sensitive microphones. This is what's called a pop filter. Again, these microphones are very sensitive, and when you're sitting close to it and causing plosives, so if you say the word pea or peas or plum or something like that, that will sound like an explosion in the microphone. And all that is the movement of air out my mouth in a particular way. It's called a plosive, but imagine it like a big kind of like, not jet of sound, like a big lump of sound that's hitting the microphone. It will make it pop. And as Lynn, as a veteran broadcaster, Lynn will tell you, the advice she got on the first day of her role at ABC Radio was don't pop. So you take an arm, like you attach the arm of this pop filter, you put it in front of the microphone, and always make sure you're guest and you are talking into a microphone like this through a pop filter. You get quite close. Also, S sounds like also have a similar problem. So that's a pop filter. They're very cheap, but they'll be in the studio as well. The connections of this microphone, nearly all kind of professional microphones you might use, are called, it's an XLR connection. You can see from there it's 3 pins, which is probably unlike any connection you've seen before. It's very old technology, but it's still the best thing we can possibly use for audio. This is an XLR cable. It's got the same 3 holes for the 3 pins. You've just got to be careful not to bend those, just line them up like you would any other connector to find where they click and then they click in together. These microphones require power, kind of like a USB device would require power. But it's a pretty old technology. They require 48 volt phantom power. We won't go into actually what that means because it's probably not important. But what is important is that these microphones will not work unless there is a device providing phantom power to this condenser microphone. So always remember, if it's a big blocky microphone like this, condenser microphone, you need to make sure there is phantom power running from something into the microphone. If you don't, you'll put your headphones on, you won't hear anything, and your guest will be sitting there wondering why you don't know what you're doing. This is, as I said before, an XLR cable, and I've got this cable running to what's called an audio interface. This is where it gets a bit like particular. There's so many different ways of setting up an audio rig. You'll always be dealing with condenser microphone probably in a studio, cable to something. Essentially, this something needs to amplify the signal that's coming from the microphone. In this case, it's a box that converts the signal from the microphone into a computer signal. And that box then connects via USB to this laptop here. So you see before, during the break, we just did some recording. Came from these microphones into the box. The signal was amplified and then sent by USB to the computer. It's essentially how it gets into the computer. Okay. There is a whole lot to learn about how these studios work that we can't cover now. But in your induction, you'll be given a guide. If you do this induction, you'll be given a guide. Instead of that red box amplifying the signal, you've got a whole set of hardware down in here. It's a bit hard to see, but essentially amplifies bigger versions of that. You'll learn how to use that. There's a Mac computer, the screen up there, the keyboard here. and there's a big mixing desk. If you're recording 2 or 3 people with 3 condenser microphones, it's not too complicated. You will do things like adjust the volume of headphones in the studio and adjust the amplification of the microphones on these racks. Again, you'll get an introduction to this if you do this induction. You need to bring a portable hard drive or a flash drive that's big enough to save hundreds of megabytes of audio when you leave the studio. I know people who've lost audio before with problems with discs and things, so just know that you need a way of transporting that home or back to the office once you've recorded it at the studio. This is the desk. It looks really complicated, but there's just a few concepts I think that you need to nail and then you'll be fine. One is microphone gain, which is essentially the volume or the strength of the signal coming out of this microphone. This desk here is a part of a system that's kind of summarised into this box here. It's sending power to the microphone so that it can get a signal out of the microphone. But you have to make a decision about how strongly you want to amplify the signal that's coming out of this microphone. It's called gain, and you need to adjust that to make sure that the person's voice coming in is heard, recorded at an appropriate level. The gain knob is this white one at the top. It's how you control the power of the signal coming in. That's probably the key requirement for operating this board. There's a closer picture of it. That's a gain knob. Again, you can see over here, this one's got gain knobs. Again, it's just controlling the power of the signal coming from this microphone to the recording device. If it's turned up too high, you'll hear it crackling and distorted, and it's called clipping. And if it's too low, the signal won't be strong enough for you to hear the person at a good volume. Now, in editing, you can pump up that signal a bit. You can kind of just turn up another dial. The issue is, though, that you may be also amplifying background noise and other things that you really don't want. So the key thing is, when you are recording as you've set up in a studio, is test out the microphones and make sure when you speak into it pretty loudly, you can speak into it quietly, that the gain of the volume is set appropriately. That's all we'll say about that. Now, this is an important one too. I talked before about a requirement of these microphones, and there are buttons on the mixing desk that say 48 volts. Does anyone want to have a guess about what that means and what you should do with that button? Exactly, yeah.
The phantom gain.
Yep, exactly. So that's the phantom power switch. And again, you can be sitting in a studio and wondering why your microphone is not working or it's getting no signal out of it. These microphones, the boxy condenser mics, these ones, like the tall, thin ones, these ones, they require phantom power, that 48 volt phantom power. That needs to be on with a red light, otherwise you're not going to get any signal. Alright, that's just like the fastest crash course in how to operate a studio. You're going to have to go in there and practice, I'm sorry to say. Like, we don't have time to run through. If we want to do another session at some point about, actually doing some more recording, I'd love to do it. So you can figure that out if you want. But please, do book in time before you actually need to interview someone or record audio, because it's best to make those mistakes in private on your own. And I've done it. I've rushed to a studio to meet someone, and I allowed 30 minutes beforehand to set up, and you just have a problem. You're like, I have no idea why this microphone there's no signal going through, and it's pretty stressful. So it's good to figure that stuff out and be familiar with the equipment. Maybe in your organisation, if you have a producer, someone who's actually going to take on that job and do it, that could be good. All right.
Sorry, can I ask a question?
Of course.
Do they have staff at these studios that you can pay to do that for you?
They don't have staff with production
Yeah.
knowledge that would be able to do that. You need to essentially hire an external producer, which you can do. I'm coming to this today with the assumption that people don't have
Yeah.
the money to
Yeah.
do that. It might be, depending on how you structure it, if you're going to be the person on the hook for this and having to produce it essentially and run this kind of operation, is that you get someone in who can help you the first time and get your hands on all the equipment, figure out how it works, see what problems there might be, and then that's repeatable. You can come back
Yeah, I'm
and do
just
it
thinking about
yourself.
the first time.
Yeah.
I'm freaking
No,
out.
if you ask library staff, they'll be
Yeah.
like, we don't know what they give you the key. Then
Yeah.
So specifically, what would you call that talent or skill? A producer, comms producer, or?
I mean, it's actually an audio engineer probably. But if you're talking to someone who has the title audio engineer, they're going to be costing you a bunch of money.
Yeah, but if you're doing something and you could amortise that across 20 podcasts.
Exactly.
The
Yep.
right ones.
Yep.
Probably.
Or if you want to get people together from this group and say like, we're going to come into the studio and do a session and learn it in the studio. I'll come and do it if you want. Like, not that there's things that like I've been like, I don't know why this is not working. I've figured out another way to do it. I'm probably making it sound more complicated and that there's all these problems you face. You won't, but it's worth figuring it out the first time on your own.
Would there be a YouTube clip?
There are lots of YouTube clips, and I mean, in lieu of this whole workshop, there's amazing stuff on YouTube about how to solve problems with audio equipment. The problem is finding the right one in the 30 minutes you've got and knowing what to search for, because sometimes they're like, microphone not working, come up with a whole range of stuff. This is based on my experience of DIY at the last minute. But they're great studios, they're really good, and you can have a lot of fun using those. Okay, so that's studio recording in 10 minutes. And if you afterwards come up and have a play with these, you hear what it sounds like. Recording in the field. So if you're out and about, if you're interviewing people on the street, and you need to be able to have a conversation with someone as you're walking, you're hassling someone, you might be outside the Royal Commission asking questions or something. You need a portable recorder. You can't do that with this microphone. You could try plugging this microphone into a portable recorder, but you would just get a shocking sound. You can't use this in an uncontrolled environment. You need, essentially, a bit of equipment that's suited to movement and getting close to people, and it's a lot sturdier, both in how it's built, so you don't break it, but in how it reacts to sound. So unlike this microphone, which is very sensitive, this one can withstand a whole lot of weird sounds and wind and handling noise and brushing past people that this microphone never could. That would sound just shocking. So you've defined your purpose and your audience and your concept and what you're going to do, and you've made a decision that you need to actually be out in a paddock, like in a field, like recording with someone in windy conditions. You might choose to get a portable recorder like this one. This is a Zoom H5 handy recorder. I think this retails for, it's still a few $100s, so it could be over $300. It's a more advanced recorder than this other one I'll show you, because it allows you to plug in XLR cables, XLR connections, and plug in pretty much any type of microphone you might want into these ports here. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. You can plug in a reporter mic like this, which again is very sturdy and able to be used in a whole range of conditions, including if it's wet and raining. But you could also, just to confuse things, you could also plug in this microphone if you wanted to use it indoors in a quiet environment, like in a studio as well. They come with these little XY stereo microphones at the top, which you can actually take off if you need to. And these capsules are also replaceable with other types of mini microphones, like a shotgun microphone. That's a really versatile recorder. If you were going to invest in something, I mean, it's a great thing to invest in. Again, it's a few $100s.
And how is that charged? Is it
Runs on AA batteries. But you can also plug it into a power source if you want it sitting on a desk for a long interview, so you don't have to worry about running out of batteries. It's a good tip, actually. Always change the batteries before an important interview. Tim Ferriss said that. He's one of his important book was, and he ran out of batteries halfway through, so he's never made that mistake.
If you use one of those microphones in a room like this, how many people could you record?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It really depends on the audio that you're going after. One big challenge, if you are using, it's one of the tips that I'll talk about in a second, being really clear about what audio you want. If I'm using this recorder and it's got these microphones and I'm holding it up, I've got their name, sorry, Kelly, and I'm recording Kelly, being really clear that it's Kelly's responses and Kelly's answers or narrative that I want to capture. If I start moving it like this, or trying to hold it even like this so that this microphone points at Kelly and this one points at me, there's a big compromise to that, which is we'll get movement noise, we'll get movement of my hand kind of moving this device. There'll also be wind kind of passing over the microphones, which makes a funny sound sometimes. And if it's at a middle distance to the two of us, we're going to have problems with volume, because even though I've got different microphones roughly pointing at us, I might put my mouth and very loud, and Kelly, if you're quieter, we're going to have a problem mixing that to be, in a balanced way. So, for an ambient sense, if you put it in the middle of the room, you could record a discussion that you could make a transcript from. But in terms of a podcast episode, it becomes pretty challenging. And what I would recommend is really you actually just focus on what Kelly is saying, get the right audio level for Kelly's voice, and don't worry about your own. Or we'll figure out how to deal with that in post-production. If you need to do narration later and say, like, I asked Kelly about this, and then you hear from Kelly.
Okay, yes.
I would
a lot of podcasts do that, don't they? And that's obviously what they're doing.
I'd prefer to do that than because you can hear it. You can hear it sometimes when people are passing a microphone back and forth. It kind of goes louder, quieter, and that's fine if it's and it has a good sound sometimes too. It's fun, like it's a running gun kind of like I'm interviewing this person, and it's fun and dynamic. But if it's a quieter, like if you're building a story, a narrative, sometimes you actually want to focus on that person. So that was a long answer to the question.
No, that's a good answer. Thank you.
So again, like it's sounding really specific, but you're defining with your purpose, your audience, and the concept of the show, what you'll need to record. Like, am I just actually, is an episode really about what Kelly's saying and her story? And I might narrate a bit later in the studio, so that my voice will sound okay through that, and it gets edited together. If I try to do too much and I'm recording everywhere, you get very little of anything. So just be really clear about what audio do you actually need to make this episode work. Like, and even write it down. I need Kelly telling me about this experience, what it meant, and you can almost tick it off like a list working through the session. So, I haven't asked Kelly about that, and the microphone's trained on her. That's one approach of me. So
would you record it all in that kind of situation with one microphone on yourself and another microphone on the subject?
So when I'm in the studio, I would have this here, and Kelly, you'd be at that microphone, and I'm at this microphone over here, and we're having a conversation.
Yeah.
That's 2 tracks, and I can deal with those separately. If I was using this, and I have used this in a number of episodes of my podcast, I do a bit of this, like back and forth, it's fine. And perfectly practical and sounds good.
Would you have, say, two of those, one for you and
2 recorders, there's probably other ways. Yeah, there's other ways of doing it. For example, and this is getting very specific, but with this recorder, because I can plug in a separate microphone, and I've got these ones here, you can actually have them both on. So sometimes I might do this, and you'd be holding that, or I'd be holding it up to you to control the distance, and I'd be talking into this one. It'll sound a bit different in the different microphones, but it gives you the option of. But again, it's like that's a particular situation, like we're out and about, we're not in a studio, where it would sound better through these. And I want to record 2 of us, and I don't want to do this. Now, I don't want to make it sound like you can't do that, because you certainly can. Like, if we were standing like this, that would sound okay. Like, definitely would be possible. Yep.
Sorry, just going back to the
Yeah.
boom and the pop filter.
Yeah, of course.
If there are 2 people in the studio, does that mean you use 2 mics and 2 pop filters?
Yep.
Or do you both hover in front of?
No, particularly when you're in a studio and you've got all these microphones, you have 1 each. If you have a panel of 4 people, everyone's got their own microphone, their own stand, their own pop filter, and you'll all hope, depending on how you set up the room, no one will be speaking to anyone else's microphone. So you've then got really careful control in post-production and during recording for each person. That's the beauty of it. You've got these 2 perfectly balanced voices having this great conversation in real detail because of the sensitivity of these microphones.
Could you use those little mics? What are they called? Lapel mics?
Lapel mics.
The ones you put on your clothes?
Yeah, you certainly can. And we talked about in the break, if you're looking to do video, it's a different game because you don't want a massive microphone. You usually don't want a massive microphone in someone's face when you're doing video. So there's 2 real options. One is a lapel mic, you put it on. They're just not as good quality. They don't get the sound that this would, nowhere near it. And even this, because of the positioning of a lapel mic, which has to be down here, just doesn't capture the voice. It can sound pretty good, and it's good with video, but when you're working just in audio, you want that voice to be as full as possible, and as detailed as possible. The other possibility with video is to use a boom mic. So you essentially have a boom arm that hangs down just out of frame, and you put on what's called a shotgun mic, which is, I don't have a shotgun mic here, but it's like a long tube, you know what I'm saying? They've got a big fluffy dead cat on them that looks like that. And it's really directional. You can point it at someone's voice from a bit of a distance, and it's a very targeted area that it'll collect sound from. So if you want to do video, a lapel mic or a boom mic with a shotgun. So I've also got this portable recorder. It's the same brand as that bigger one. It's called a Zoom H1. This one's about $130. A much cheaper option. And like we were talking about before, you can use this particularly when you're out and about and you want to do interviews, holding it relatively close to someone and controlling the gain, like we talked about with that white knob in the studio, or this knob here. There's just essentially an input level controller on the side here, which adjusts the gain for this recorder. Much simpler device. You can just hold that up to someone, do a reasonably good interview, you'll get good sound out of that. If it gets windy, any movement of air around these makes a big ruffling noise, you can get this thing, it's called a dead cat, like I mentioned before. It's very strange, but that just stops the movement of air around those microphones. That makes a big whooshing, big whomping sound, which is no good. You can also put one of these ones on there as well. It looks silly, it looks strange, but you'll be thankful later.
It just records your own.
Exactly. So this has output settings. You can record it as a WAV file, which I recommend you do, which is uncompressed audio. You can save it as an MP3 to save space. But essentially what that is doing is there's a little computer in here then compressing it down like a zip file into what is still a very good quality audio that you've got this to work with when you edit. So do always record in WAV, W-A-V. Very good question.
Is that a USB transfer?
Yep, it's got a USB port on it here. You can also just take the card out of it and pop that into a card reader like your laptop will often have. A slot, you can put that in and just copy it off. This is a really good solution. I mean, even when you might use these in a studio that you hire, but I've done interviews before as well where this is the only thing we've got, and I've got this clamp. You can buy them on eBay for like $15 or something. and you can screw this, there's a thread on the back, and then I would just put that close to who I was interviewing. And I might be sitting over here, and my voice or my questions don't matter to this bit of audio. So I just want to hear Lydia's voice on this bit, and it's recording. The volume is set. The gain is set just for Lydia's voice so that it sounds good to Lydia. Yes?
When you're saying setting the gain, are you talking about at the appropriate level so it doesn't clip? Is that
Correct.
what you mean? So how do you know at what point to set the gain?
It's a really good question. It's one of the tips coming up anyway. So you always monitor with headphones. Whether you've got some earbuds, you might have your own earbuds here today, or come and give it a try with one of these sets of headphones. You should essentially always have plugged into any device that you're using to record a set of these headphones, because you'll hear it clipping, you'll hear it distorting.
What does clipping mean?
So clipping means, who else said, sorry, I have headphones on. Clipping means the signal is too high for the device and it's distorting. So the sound is too loud, and in the same way, the gain has been set too high. So you've asked the microphone to act too sensitively. Like, try and pick up all of this sound, please, microphone, and then you put it close to someone and the signal is just through the roof. It's called clipping because the signal hits its maximum and gets clipped off.
It's quite apparent, the sound.
Yeah, it's an apparent sound, and there's also a indicator light here, and it's on most recorders. If I turn this gain up and start talking into it, you can see it start to flash this red light. And it's a pretty obvious sign that it's clipping and not working. But when you're busy and distracted and having a great conversation with someone, it's something that you'll miss unless you're wearing headphones and constantly listening for what that sounds like. You could miss ruined audio that's unusable and can't be fixed in post-production. You can't magically reduce it back down in any way because the signal essentially doesn't. The signal encoding a good voice doesn't exist anymore. It's not even there to use. So, with the gain 2, that's not to be confused with headphone volume. So there's two variables, one being the signal that's coming into the recorder and the other being how loud do you want it to be in headphones. So you look at these meters. I'll unscrew this again. And come up and have a look and have a play with it, and I'll show you what clipping looks like. You won't be able to see it, probably can't. But there's two little meters up here. They're jumping up and down as I talk. You can see when they are going through the roof and when they're not, and you get used to working with that visual. Again, come up and have a look afterwards. It's worth having a play. This one in particular, you go with the $130 kind of recorder like this, there's a lot of handling noise when you put this in your hand. They're made of plastic because it's sturdy, but you'll hear, if you come and try it, that moving my hand like this, it makes a kind of a rubbing sound, essentially. So you've got to be really still and careful with it. Or you attach it to something, including, you can get just even a little handle that you screw into that, and then you won't get that sound. But it's just one of the challenges of having a sensitive microphone in a small device. When you encounter wind and outdoor recording situations, you need to be really careful. Always have your headphones on, and sometimes it will be too windy and you can't get a proper sound. You might put on one of these, but it still won't completely solve the problem. And again, just always think about where you've got the microphone. Could it be closer to someone to exclude outside noise? Could it be closer to my mouth with the gain turned down? So down here, you'd need the gain turned up so that my voice is captured properly, but we have all this outside noise. How about we move it closer, make my voice a much stronger signal and turn the gain down. Always monitoring with headphones to hear what that sounds like and whether it's clipping, or whether we need to actually turn it up a bit, turn the gain up.
What does that mean? Be clear about what tape you need to begin recording.
It was the point I think I was trying to make before, which was
Who you recording?
who are you recording and why?
Oh, sorry. Okay, yeah.
If I'm in the constant battle to try and both get us on tape at a good audio level and I'm moving it, and it means a little bit louder because I move a bit close at one time, and it's unnecessary, I would just focus on getting the audio from you, just getting the tape of you saying what I need to get you on tape saying. Because later, and what I tend to do is saying, well, if I have something that I really want to say, which is usually I think like, my voice doesn't need to be in this episode. I'm trying to get someone else's story. If I really need to put my voice in, I'll do it later in the studio. I'll just say, we then did this, or we talked about this for a while, or this is what's interesting about the conversation, and then that is edited in later. Yeah,
you
cool.
had some notes on smartphone on the previous slide.
Yeah.
I just wondered about your advice on using the smartphone.
You can get audio out of a smartphone that can work and could be like a passable quality to put in a podcast episode, but having a structured approach to recording more than one episode of a podcast, or trying to get nice audio for an episode, it's very difficult to use smartphone microphones. They're just too small and not built for this purpose. Usually it's impossible to monitor. Like you often can't hear the live sound coming through and what it sounds like. You can only hear it afterwards. At work, I would use it to record for a transcript if I needed a transcript of something, but otherwise, and it's only like last resort as well. If you happen to be out and about and you're like, there's the person I've always wanted to interview and I'm going to hassle them on the street, that's all you've got, then try. But not being able to monitor and just having a microphone that's not built for a purpose is
And is there a website that you recommend to buy the recorders from, or a retailer?
There's one website that I use a lot, and I mean, I guess I would recommend them. It's storedj.com.au. It's a offshoot of Manning's, and they just have a really good website and a large range of products. I'm turning into an ad for StoreDJ, but it's where I got nearly all of this stuff actually. I may have got these microphones from JB Hi-Fi. But do look around and maybe talk some of their sales. I don't know if you have to spend your money this calendar year or depending on what you need, but really depends on what you're buying, but that's a good place to start. Yes.
I don't know how many people here are CLCs, but sometimes law firms have this stuff. Is that right?
They do. Some law firms are getting into podcasts, so I'm trying to get poor law firms or a law firm to do more podcasts.
I'm just conscious because I know that I've been offered pro bono support from other parts of the law firm that supports Oxfam, and if there are other CLCs here, then this is pretty daunting for me to think about the equipment, the technology use, the investment of my time in
getting across all this stuff.
I just wondered, do you know if law firms would normally have this equipment?
For some podcasts, I know law firms that make podcasts that would have some of this equipment. Often it's a bit of a mix of equipment. They kind of have an in-between of this. They might not use these types of microphones like in a studio. They use dynamic microphones. They're all fine. But yeah, you can ask the question. Just say like, can we use your stuff? Don't have to spend any money. If you can find ways of avoiding. We better move on because we are very short on time. Editing. I mean, again, we've talked about spending money for someone else to edit. There are people, really experienced producers in Melbourne who would edit episodes of your podcast. If they're simple, they could be $100, $150, $200. To more complicated episodes where you spend more. I just note that because it might be an option if editing does take a long time. Can take a long time. If you're going to do it in-house, I'll just recommend that you download Audacity. It's free. There are all these other great editing suites. digital audio workstations, they're called, but you should just get Audacity, just download it, it's free. To be able to, that's the website and what it looks like. It's also here on this laptop if you want to come and just have a quick look. I'll give you a tour afterwards. This is what a very simple podcast session looks like. This is actually Lynn's interview with Lynn. I have just selected bits of the interview I wanted to be in the episode. I literally drag, select that, cut it, and drop it there. And here's another bit I wanted, so I just selected that from the big long file and dropped it in there. Did that and had the volumes adjusted. Put in some music. The music's actually not in here, it's back there, but it looks the same. I'll put in a bit of narration myself. But you're really just dragging and dropping bits of audio like you would in Premiere or iMovie or anything else. Yes.
Quick question. From what you record to what you end up with, how long is what you start with, and what's the ideal kind of podcast length?
Well, it goes completely to your purpose and your audience, because there are podcasts that are 3-5 minutes long, episodes that are 5 minutes long, and there are, I know of like one podcast episode that's 14 hours long or something. But you know, it's an art piece, not an informative podcast. I forgot what podcast it was. So, there's no ideal length. Some people say people tune out after 30 minutes, but that's on you and your content and who's listening to it. Because if someone really wants to hear this, they'll listen for an hour, they might listen for 2, but you essentially need to get in the head of your audience, which is why we so clearly define it, so that at every decision along the way.
So what's lawyer by day?
Oh, it varies between 30 minutes to an hour.
And how much do you actually record before you get down to that?
That can vary from like 40 minutes to 3 hours,
wow,
depending on how fun it was and how much time the guest has. But it's a big mistake too when I am trying to make a podcast that's between 30 minutes and an hour, and I talk to someone for 2 hours. Like, that's silly. It's interesting, but it's silly, because what do you do with that? You spend hours editing and choosing, and when you should just be targeted with your questions. Know what take you need from what person and get it, and then finish. But this is all like easier said than done, right? So there's no rule about how long editing takes, because you might just record an hour with a person and that's the episode, and you don't cut out ums and ahs, and you don't be a perfectionist about it, and that's it. It doesn't take you any time at all. So again, depends on purpose, audience, the concept. So this is not even a crash course in editing. One thing I'll note is that Audacity will not let you export something as an MP3, your final product, without taking an extra step. Just go to the website in the notes, and you've just got to download a plugin that will allow you to export it. It's for a really particular reason that Audacity doesn't bundle it up together, so you just have to download it separately for Mac or for PC. So look in the notes for that. The one thing I will emphasize is when you export audio from Audacity, you have the very important process of filling out the metadata on your episode. You've got to have the organisation's name, or your name, whoever's creating it, the title of the episode, the podcast title, the number, episode number, the year you can put in, it doesn't really matter, and then the genre needs to be podcast as well. Setting that genre as podcast means that an audio player will group your audio file into the podcast section or whatever. It's like iTunes will say, oh, that's a podcast, because I know you've told me here. This comments bit is really important. It's what we talked about before. You need, and the ABC stats show that it's actually really important what's in that summary of the episode, explaining to people what the episode is and why they should listen to it. And you'll all be much better than me at writing that stuff as experienced communications people. So I'll leave that to you, but try it out and workshop things and see what works. But fill out that metadata, because it's how any device will know what this is and where to put it. We've talked about royalty-free music already for editing. And then we get to sharing. This is an important part of the process. To get it onto the directories I talked about before, iTunes, Spotify, you do need cover art. There are really particular requirements for the cover art. It has to be at least 1400 by 1400 pixels. It's got to be, it just needs to look good at 300 by 300 when it's scaled down. Ideally, it's in a JPEG format, not a PNG format. If you don't know what I'm talking about at all, you have to speak to your communications people or someone technical who can do a bit of graphic design. Again, I wouldn't worry too much about getting the exact right artwork for your podcast. Focus on something practical that shows what it's about with the title in it, which might be the organisation and the podcast name. There's options. You can get people to design you something for $100 to a few $100 on sites like 99 Designs, but I wouldn't bother with that. See, if you have to do it yourself, use Canva. It's a web platform for graphic design. You can do your CV in it, you can do all sorts of stuff. They've got great templates. But you can create a 1400 by 1400 pixel logo. Just choose a template, put the text in, and then save it as a JPEG, and then you're done. Does that make sense? You need to host your podcast somewhere. It may be that on your website for your organisation, you could actually upload your finished episodes to that website, and then they'd be available from that website. And there would be ways of getting the RSS feed we talked about before set up. But it's more complicated. Your web host is probably not as suited to hosting podcasts, but you should talk to your web content team to see if they could host the podcast and make it work. And if their answer is I don't know or no, then you move on to third-party providers. Lynn might be able to tell us about her experience with Podbean. She put the Law Foundation's podcast on Podbean. I use Blueberry, but I don't necessarily just recommend that you all use that. I think you need to explore some of these options based on cost. It can range from free to $30 a month to host podcast material, and the price is usually related to how much material do you want to upload per month. So if you're producing an episode every week and it's 60 megabytes, you'll pay more for that. Again, it comes back to the purpose, your audience, your schedule, how much you're going to produce, how much audio you're going to produce, how often you'll need to upload it. But look at these, it's exploding, like providers for podcasting services is going through the roof. Whooshka is an Australian outfit, and they, like many others, are looking at ways of helping you advertise, essentially getting advertising dollars from your podcast material. But check out these as well, Blueberry, Libsyn, and SoundCloud. The actual upload process is very simple. It's like uploading any file once you've got your provider sorted out. You need to then register your podcast with the various directories if you want people to be able to find it. There's an address for iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Blueberry as a directory that I've noted there. And there are others. The benefit of registering with the key ones like iTunes and Stitcher is that other directories aggregate from those. Many directories actually just pull everything from iTunes as well and say, well, if it's in iTunes, I'll put it in my other directory. So try and get on as many of these as you can. Spotify is being a bit exclusive still, and often the only way to kind of get on Spotify reliably, get your podcast on Spotify, is to be hosted with particular providers that Spotify works with. So look at that list. If you really want to be on Spotify, look at the list of providers that Spotify works with, and you may need to host your podcast with one of those providers. There can be a delay in registering your podcast and having it available on a directory like iTunes. If you have a launch date of 7 December in 2 days, and you haven't yet registered your podcast, your RSS feed, it will not appear for several days, and you might not have a podcast to promote on iTunes for your launch day. So the message is register it early, create the feed and have it sitting there ahead of time, and register with iTunes and these other directories before you actually want to launch your podcast, because it means it'll be there ready for people to look up as soon as you're promoting it. The way people get around that, if they don't have an episode ready to upload to make the feed have something in it, they'll create a preview episode, just like 3 minutes, a quick excerpt of what you might expect from the podcast, just even saying, hello, this is Organisation X, I'm Y, this is what we're going to do in the podcast, looking forward to having you subscribe, please subscribe. You register that with iTunes, and then as soon as you're on launch day, you're ready to go. You upload your episode and it'll appear in iTunes. Okay, we've already run over time. Promotion comes down to probably you and your teams, which you're so well versed at, which is getting a social media strategy together to promote what you're doing. Finding a way to get audio onto Instagram and other platforms. For example, make a video with an image of your guest, or make a video that has a still image of the organisation's logo, but's got 60 seconds of audio from the episode. It's a great way of distributing something through platforms that are, focused on photography or visuals, but getting your audio out there. And people do listen to it, so it's worth doing. Okay, that has just been the fastest run through of a map of how to create a podcast, and I'm sure you will all just be wondering, why is it complicated? But it's really exciting too. It's a fantastic opportunity. It's a great time when all this audio, they're calling it the renaissance of audio, is happening, and you're all here at the starting point of something pretty exciting. So thank you for coming. Please feel free to hang around and have a play with this stuff if you want to have a look or talk more. But I appreciate you all coming to talk about podcasts.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Sorry for running over
Oh,
time.
not at all. Anytime. I'm sure people will stay and listen all day. As an aging broadcaster, the renaissance of audio is a great joy to me, and I think as communicators and people involved in making sure that people understand the offer of your organisations, you get the fact that telling them a story in a compelling and companionable and incredibly portable way is very effective. And I know that Mark has taken you through a spinning array of content today, and bonus content on how to create your logo and which sites to upload to. So I think you've done incredibly well as an intro to podcasting. I hope you have enjoyed it and appreciated Mark's contribution. We have an honesty. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Next better information I think will be next year now, so stay tuned for offerings from us in 2019. Merry Christmas, I can now say that, given we're in the towards the end of the first week of December, and go well. Thanks for coming. Thank you.